Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Silent Storyteller. Before we begin tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment below if you enjoy bedtime stories filled with real events and unforgettable moments. Your support helps me bring you more stories to accompany your nights. Now, let me take you back to Texas in the bitterly cold month of February 2021. The night was unusually quiet, and the temperature had dropped to levels Texans rarely experienced. In Houston, the streets were blanketed with ice, streetlights flickered, and a heavy silence wrapped around the city. Inside their homes, families gathered close, relying on blankets, candles, and small gas stoves to fight the creeping cold. One of those families was the Johnsons. Michael Johnson, a father of two, had just returned from a long shift as a nurse at Memorial Hermann Hospital. The icy roads had turned his usual 30-minute drive into a 2-hour crawl. When he finally stepped through the door of his modest house on Westheimer Road, the lights were already gone. His wife, Caroline, was sitting with their children near the fireplace, feeding small pieces of wood to keep the flames alive. The power outage had started hours earlier, and no one knew when it would return. Outside, the storm raged on, covering power lines in sheets of ice and knocking down trees that had stood for decades. Neighbors peeked out of their frosted windows, their breath visible in the dim candlelight. Some tried to start their cars for warmth, others called relatives, only to find phone batteries slowly draining with no way to recharge them. As the night deepened, the cold pressed harder against the walls. Inside the Johnsons' home, the atmosphere was tense yet strangely unifying. The children, Emma and Daniel, clutched their stuffed toys, whispering questions about why the lights had disappeared and if they would come back soon. Caroline wrapped another layer of blanket around them, trying to disguise her own fear with a calm smile. Michael looked around the room, realizing this wasn't just a passing blackout. It was something bigger, something that would test not just their patience but their endurance. The storm outside howled like an uninvited guest, shaking the windows, rattling the roof, and reminding everyone that they were at the mercy of nature. In the distance, sirens wailed. Firefighters and paramedics were responding to accidents caused by icy roads, while others rushed to homes where elderly residents had no heat. The city, usually alive with music, traffic, and neon lights, felt frozen in time. That night in Texas, survival meant more than just keeping warm. It meant staying together, keeping hope alive, and finding strength in the small things, like the glow of a candle or the warmth of a shared blanket. And so, with the storm pressing harder and the lights still gone, the Johnson family braced themselves for what the next day would bring. Would you like me to continue the story by expanding on the following morning? How the family and their neighbors coped when water pipes began to freeze and stores ran out of supplies? Or would you prefer me to focus more on Michael's experience as a nurse, witnessing the crisis inside the overwhelmed hospital? The Johnson family barely slept that night. The sound of the storm outside, the sharp gusts of wind slapping against the roof, and the eerie silence that followed each gust kept them restless. Each time the fire in the fireplace grew smaller, Michael would rise and toss in another piece of wood. By dawn, their supply of firewood had shrunk to a small pile, and the bitter reality of the storm's duration began to sink in. When the morning light finally crept in through the frosted windows, it revealed a Texas that few had ever seen. Streets were coated in a thick layer of ice, trees sagged under the weight of frozen branches, and cars looked like sculptures trapped in a glassy glaze. Neighbors cautiously stepped outside, bundled in mismatched layers of clothing, scarves, and gloves. The usual morning sounds of barking dogs or cars starting were replaced by the crunch of boots against ice, and the low hum of concern passed from one person to another. Michael, despite his exhaustion, knew he had a responsibility at the hospital. Patients depended on him, and though his own family needed him just as much, he made the difficult choice to prepare for another dangerous journey to work. Caroline tried to convince him to stay, reminding him of the treacherous roads and the risk of not making it back. But Michael only gave her a tired smile. "If I don't go, someone else's father or mother may not make it through this storm," he said quietly. With his car frozen solid, he borrowed a neighbor's old pickup truck, one of the few vehicles able to navigate the icy streets. The drive to Memorial Hermann Hospital was slow and nerve-wracking. Abandoned cars littered the roadside, some with doors left open where drivers had given up and sought shelter elsewhere. Traffic lights were dark, forcing drivers to rely on hand signals or the unspoken rule of cautious patience. At one intersection, Michael stopped to help push a stranded sedan out of the way, joining two strangers in the effort before continuing his own journey. Back at the Johnsons' home, Caroline faced a different set of challenges. The temperature inside the house had dropped sharply, and the children's cheeks were flushed from the cold. She boiled water on a small camping stove they had kept in the garage, rationing every drop of propane. Breakfast was simple: instant oatmeal mixed with the last of the honey. The children ate quietly, shivering even under blankets, their small faces etched with questions they didn't voice. Caroline pretended everything was under control, but deep down she was frightened. She worried about the pipes bursting, about the dwindling food supply, about the possibility that Michael might not make it home that night. As the hours passed, the storm showed no signs of relenting. Caroline decided to check on the elderly couple next door, the Petersons, who lived alone and rarely went out. Wrapping herself in layers of coats, she walked across the slippery driveway and knocked on their door. When Mr. Peterson opened it, she was met with a blast of even colder air. Their heater had failed completely, and their small fireplace was empty. Without hesitation, Caroline invited them to bring their blankets and join her family. Within half an hour, the Petersons were sitting beside Emma and Daniel, grateful for the company and the small warmth the Johnsons' fire provided. At the hospital, Michael stepped into chaos. The backup generators were working, but only partially. Hallways were dimly lit, and nurses moved quickly between patients, their faces etched with fatigue. Some medical equipment had to be shut down to conserve power, forcing staff to improvise. Michael found himself tending to elderly patients who had been brought in with hypothermia, children with respiratory issues worsened by the cold, and car accident victims injured on the slick roads. Each patient was a reminder that the storm's reach extended far beyond his own household. One woman, wrapped in layers of borrowed blankets, clutched Michael's hand and whispered through chattering teeth, "I never thought I'd freeze in Texas." He offered her a gentle smile, though his heart ached. He thought of his own children, their small bodies curled under blankets at home, and prayed that Caroline had found a way to keep them safe. By late afternoon, news spread through the hospital corridors that water systems across the city were failing. Pipes were bursting, flooding homes and businesses, while others froze completely, leaving entire neighborhoods without running water. The announcement brought a wave of unease, for everyone knew what that meant. No clean drinking water, no way to cook, no sanitation. Michael overheard doctors discussing how quickly supplies of bottled water were disappearing from stores. Meanwhile, back at the Johnson home, Caroline faced that very reality. The kitchen faucet sputtered once, twice, and then went silent. When she tried to turn on the bathroom tap, nothing came. She stood there for a moment, her hands trembling, before filling every pot and container she had with the small reserve of water left in the pipes. The Petersons watched quietly, understanding the gravity of the situation. Emma asked softly if they could still make hot chocolate. Caroline knelt, stroked her daughter's hair, and said, "We'll save what we have for later, sweetheart." Night fell again, darker and colder than before. The Johnson home was now a small refuge, its living room crowded with bodies huddled together for warmth. The fireplace crackled softly, but the woodpile was nearly gone. Outside, the sound of the storm continued, though it had shifted from relentless winds to the creak of ice, laden branches breaking under their own weight. Every snap echoed like a warning shot in the quiet night. Michael did not make it home. He had decided, along with other staff, to stay at the hospital overnight. It was safer than risking the frozen roads, and the hospital needed all hands. Caroline lay awake, staring at the flickering shadows on the ceiling, wondering if she could keep her family safe another night without him. In the distance, she heard sirens again. Another fire had broken out, likely from a family desperate to stay warm using unsafe methods. The storm had not only frozen the city, but also ignited dangers that no one had anticipated. The children finally fell asleep, curled beside the Petersons, while Caroline sat by the dwindling fire. She thought about how quickly life had changed, how just days ago they had complained about small inconveniences, like slow internet or traffic jams. Now survival was measured in blankets, candles, and drops of water. Somewhere in Houston, Michael leaned against a hospital wall, closing his eyes for just a moment. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind drifted to Caroline and the children. He imagined their faces in the glow of the firelight and whispered a silent promise to return to them as soon as he could. The storm had stolen their comfort, their security, and their peace, but it had not taken their will to endure. And as the frozen city held its breath, waiting for relief, the Johnson family and countless others braced themselves for what the next day would bring, holding on to the faint but stubborn hope that the lights would return, that warmth would return, and that Texas would rise from the ice stronger than before. The second morning arrived with no improvement in the weather. The storm had laid a suffocating silence over the city, as though the world outside the windows had been frozen in place. Cars still stood motionless under layers of ice, power lines sagged like tired arms, and the streets bore no sign of the usual rush of life. Instead, there was only the crunch of boots from the few who dared to venture out, and the occasional crack of tree branches snapping under the weight of ice. Inside the Johnson home, the air had grown even colder overnight. Caroline awoke to find frost forming along the edges of the living room windows. The fireplace had gone out during the night, and the remaining wood was stacked in a pitifully small pile. She rose quietly, careful not to wake the children or the Petersons, and added the last 2 pieces of wood. The small flames licked upward reluctantly, casting a fragile glow that seemed far too weak against the creeping cold. Emma stirred and sat up, clutching her stuffed bear. She asked in a whisper if her father would come home today. Caroline hesitated. She wanted to give her daughter certainty, to say yes and soothe the child's fears, but the truth was harder to grasp. Instead, she brushed Emma's hair back gently and said, "He's doing important work at the hospital, sweetheart. He'll come home as soon as he can." The Petersons tried to help however they could. Mrs. Peterson, frail but spirited, kept the children occupied with old stories while Mr. Peterson searched through his belongings for anything useful. He returned from their home with a few extra blankets, a half-burned candle, and a small supply of canned goods. Caroline felt a surge of gratitude, though the meager offerings only underscored the reality that supplies were running dangerously low. By mid-morning, Caroline made the difficult choice to step outside and look for firewood. Wrapping herself in every layer of clothing she could find, she braved the icy streets. Each step was treacherous, the ground as slick as glass. She saw her breath billowing in the air as she walked past silent houses with darkened windows. Some families had scribbled signs on their doors with chalk or markers, messages like "no power," "need help," or "elderly inside." She felt a pang of helplessness, knowing she could do little for them when her own family was barely scraping by. At a nearby park, Caroline found a few fallen branches. She struggled to break them down into smaller pieces, her hands numb and clumsy from the cold. A man from down the street, bundled in a thick coat, approached and offered to help. Together, they gathered what they could, though the supply was minimal. Caroline thanked him and dragged the bundle back home, her legs aching from the effort. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Michael faced a different kind of hardship. The emergency room was overflowing. Patients lined the hallways, bundled in coats and blankets brought from home, shivering as they waited for attention. The backup generator was still running, but staff were warned it could fail if the fuel supply was disrupted. Doctors rationed medications and prioritized care for the most critical cases. Michael assisted in triaging patients, his hands never still. He treated frostbite, hypothermia, and injuries from accidents on the ice-coated roads. One man had slipped on his porch and broken his leg. Another had been in a collision after losing control of his truck on an overpass. In between emergencies, Michael helped distribute bottled water to patients and staff, each bottle a precious resource. During a brief break, Michael checked his phone, hoping for a message from Caroline. The battery was nearly dead and the signal weak, but a single text came through. "We are safe. Cold but together. Kids miss you." He felt a wave of relief, though the longing to be home with them ached more deeply than before. Back at the Johnson house, the day dragged slowly. The children grew restless, asking when the lights would come back. Caroline tried to keep them busy with card games and whispered songs, but the cold made it hard to concentrate on anything. The Petersons told stories of winters from their childhood in the northern states, though even they admitted they had never faced conditions quite like this in Texas. By evening, the small pile of wood Caroline had gathered was nearly gone. She rationed the flames, letting the fire die down to embers before feeding it again. Dinner consisted of canned beans warmed over the camping stove, shared between everyone. It wasn't much, but it kept them going. Night fell once more, heavier and darker than the one before. The city seemed to vanish into the storm, its usual glow erased. Caroline tucked the children into their makeshift bed near the fireplace and sat awake, her ears attuned to every sound outside. She heard footsteps crunching past the house and froze, clutching a flashlight like a weapon. The footsteps faded, but the fear lingered. In times like these, desperation could push people to do things they would never normally consider. At the hospital, Michael and the staff faced another crisis. A burst pipe had flooded part of the lower floor, forcing them to relocate patients in the dark corridors. Nurses waded through ankle-deep freezing water, their shoes soaked, carrying equipment and supplies to higher levels. Michael worked alongside them, exhaustion etched into every movement. He hadn't slept properly in days, yet the thought of leaving his post never crossed his mind. By the third day of the storm, the Johnsons were reaching their breaking point. The last of the firewood was gone, and the house grew colder with each passing hour. Caroline wrapped the children in every blanket they owned, holding them close as their small bodies trembled. The Petersons tried to remain optimistic, but their faces betrayed their fear. Caroline knew she had to make a choice. They couldn't stay in the house much longer without heat or water. She had heard from neighbors that a community shelter had been opened at a nearby school, one of the few buildings with a functioning generator. But reaching it would mean braving the icy streets with 2 children and an elderly couple. The risk was immense, yet staying might be worse. She lay awake that night, listening to the steady breathing of her children, weighing every possibility. Her mind drifted to Michael, imagining him surrounded by patients, fighting his own battle in the cold corridors of the hospital. She whispered a silent prayer that he was safe, that he would return to them soon. At the hospital, Michael sat against a wall for a brief moment of rest. His body was sore, his hands cracked from the constant washing in freezing water. Yet his spirit held firm. He thought of Caroline and the children huddled at home, and it gave him strength. He promised himself that when the storm ended, he would walk through their front door no matter what it took. The storm had stripped Texas of its comfort, but it had also revealed something else: resilience. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers working side by side, families holding together through the darkest nights. The Johnsons, like countless others, were finding that survival was not just about firewood or water. It was about courage, hope, and the unyielding will to see the dawn of a brighter day. And as the storm pressed on, with the city still frozen in silence, the Johnson family braced themselves for the decision that could change everything. Whether to remain in the fragile shelter of their home, or step out into the perilous streets in search of safety and warmth. Caroline did not sleep that night. She lay awake, staring into the shadows on the ceiling, listening to the faint crackle of the last ember in the fireplace. The children were curled against her, their bodies warm but restless, while the Petersons whispered quietly to each other in the corner. Every sound in the house seemed amplified, the groan of the wooden beams contracting in the cold, the whistle of wind sneaking through unseen cracks, the occasional thud of ice falling from the roof. When dawn finally came, it offered little comfort. The light revealed a living room coated in a thin film of frost. The air was so cold that Caroline could see her breath. She rose carefully, her joints stiff, and made her way to the kitchen. Turning the faucet, she confirmed what she had feared. Not a drop of water came out. The pipes had frozen solid overnight. She set her jaw, knowing this meant they had only the water they had saved in pots and bottles. Breakfast was meager. 2 slices of bread toasted weakly over the camping stove, divided among 4 people, with a few spoonfuls of peanut butter. Emma frowned at the small portion, but she ate without complaint. Daniel asked when they could have cereal again, his voice a faint echo of normal life. Caroline smiled softly, promising him that as soon as the stores reopened and the lights returned, they would buy all the cereal he wanted. Deep inside, though, she wondered when that day would come. By mid-morning, Caroline made her decision. They could not remain in the house any longer. Without firewood or water, and with the temperature dropping further, staying meant risking their lives. She told the Petersons of her plan to take everyone to the shelter at Lamar High School, where the city had reportedly set up generators and provided heat. Mr. Peterson hesitated, reminding her of the icy streets and the long walk, but even he admitted they had little choice. They spent the next hour preparing. Caroline bundled Emma and Daniel in layer after layer of clothing, wrapping scarves around their faces until only their eyes peeked through. The Petersons gathered their most necessary belongings: medication, a few cans of food, and a blanket each. Caroline filled bottles with the last of their water supply and packed the remaining food into a small bag. She took one last look around the house, her heart heavy with the thought of leaving it behind in such a state. Then, with a deep breath, she opened the front door. The cold air hit them like a wall. The street outside was an alien landscape, coated in thick ice, with tree branches lying shattered across lawns. They walked slowly, Caroline holding the children's hands, while Mr. Peterson shuffled carefully beside them. Each step was a struggle, the ground slick beneath their boots. They passed houses with windows boarded or covered with frost, doors that remained shut, and driveways abandoned. A few neighbors were outside, carrying supplies or checking on each other, and some waved weakly at Caroline's group as they passed. Halfway down the street, they encountered a family huddled by their car, trying unsuccessfully to start the engine. The father, wrapped in a heavy coat, explained that their fuel had frozen in the tank. Caroline offered them half a bottle of water and words of encouragement before continuing her journey. She wished she could do more, but every drop of water and every step of energy was precious now. The walk felt endless. The icy wind whipped against their faces, and Emma began to cry quietly, her small legs trembling with fatigue. Caroline carried her for stretches at a time, despite the ache in her arms. Daniel stumbled more than once, but he pressed on bravely, clutching his stuffed bear under his coat. The Petersons moved slowly, their age showing with each cautious step, but they never complained. When they finally reached Lamar High School, the sight of people gathered outside gave them hope. Volunteers in reflective vests guided families inside, offering blankets and bottles of water. The warmth of the generator-powered gymnasium was overwhelming after days of cold. Caroline nearly cried with relief as she guided her children inside. They were assigned a corner space, given cots and extra blankets. Emma and Daniel immediately collapsed onto the bedding, their exhaustion overtaking them. Inside the shelter, the atmosphere was a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. Families shared stories of frozen pipes, collapsed roofs, and nights spent huddled in cars. Volunteers handed out simple meals, rice, beans, and bottled water. Medical staff checked on the elderly and those showing signs of hypothermia. Caroline felt a strange sense of unity among the chaos. Everyone was suffering, but they were suffering together. Meanwhile, Michael remained at the hospital, unaware that his family had moved to the shelter. His shift had stretched into another sleepless day. The hospital halls were colder than ever, with some sections shut down entirely due to burst pipes. Patients lay under layers of blankets, their breaths visible in the air. The cafeteria had run out of hot meals, so staff survived on granola bars and bottled water. Michael found himself at the bedside of a young man with severe frostbite. The patient's hands were swollen and discolored, his eyes wide with fear. Michael spoke softly, assuring him that treatment would save most of the tissue, though he knew the process would be painful. Moments later, he rushed to assist an elderly woman who had collapsed from dehydration. He felt as though he were being pulled in 1,000 directions at once, but he refused to stop. Each patient reminded him why he had chosen this path. During a rare break, Michael checked his phone again. This time, there was no signal. He stared at the blank screen, longing for any word from Caroline. He pictured her huddled with the children in the cold house and prayed she had found some way to keep them warm. The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he buried it beneath his duties, knowing he could not afford distraction. At the shelter, Caroline was beginning to feel the weight lift slightly. For the first time in days, the children slept without shivering. The Petersons were receiving medical attention, and she had been given a small meal that tasted better than anything she had eaten in years. Still, she could not shake the thought of Michael. She wondered if he had eaten, if he had slept, if he even knew they were safe. That night in the shelter was different from the nights at home. There was the hum of the generator, the murmur of dozens of families, and the occasional cry of a baby. Yet there was also a warmth that wrapped around Caroline like a protective embrace. She sat quietly, stroking Emma's hair as she slept, and thought about how quickly life had shifted. Just a week earlier, they had argued about what to cook for dinner or when to pay the electricity bill. Now those worries seemed so small compared to the fight for survival. In the hospital, Michael prepared for another long night. He had lost count of the hours, but he knew the storm would eventually pass. He clung to that thought like a lifeline. Every time exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, he pictured his family, and it pushed him forward. He promised himself he would see them soon, that the nightmare would end, and that Texas would thaw under the returning sun. And so the days stretched on, the storm gripping the city in its icy hold. Families endured, neighbors supported one another, and the Johnsons, separated by circumstance but united in spirit, held tightly to the hope that tomorrow would bring light, warmth, and reunion. The night at Lamar High School shelter stretched long, but was bearable compared to the freezing silence of the Johnson home. The constant hum of the generator filled the air, a reminder that at least here, there was light and a fragile sense of safety. Families lay side by side, wrapped in blankets provided by volunteers, while the children whispered stories or drifted into restless sleep. Caroline sat awake for hours, watching over Emma and Daniel, and occasionally glancing at the Petersons, who slept in fragile stillness. Morning came with no sun, just a pale gray light filtering through the tall windows of the gymnasium. The storm had not ended, but the winds outside had grown less violent. Caroline rose quietly and joined the line forming at the corner of the shelter, where volunteers served breakfast. It was simple, lukewarm oatmeal and bottled water, but to Caroline it felt like a gift. She carried the trays back to her children, who sat up with sleepy smiles. For the first time in days, Emma laughed, a small sound that made Caroline's heart ache with both relief and longing for normalcy. Around them, the shelter buzzed with quiet conversation. Some families shared news about the conditions in their neighborhoods. Roofs that had collapsed under the weight of ice, burst pipes flooding homes, and stores completely empty of supplies. Others spoke in hushed tones about relatives they hadn't heard from, their faces drawn with worry. Caroline listened, though she did not contribute much. She was grateful simply to know that her children were safe for now. Meanwhile, at Memorial Hermann Hospital, Michael's world was growing heavier. His shifts bled into one another, with barely any rest in between. The hospital had become a haven for those with nowhere else to go. Patients filled every bed, and some lay in hallways with blankets piled on top of them. Doctors and nurses moved through the corridors like shadows, driven by duty, their bodies fueled more by determination than by food or sleep. Michael found himself tending to patients whose conditions reflected the storm's grip on the city. An elderly man arrived with pneumonia after spending nights without heat. A young child was admitted with severe dehydration, her family unable to find clean water. A middle-aged woman came in with burns on her hands after trying to warm her house using a makeshift fire in a metal container. Each case was a tragedy, yet each was treated with the same urgency. During one short pause, Michael sat in the staff lounge, staring at the vending machine. Most of the items were gone, and the few that remained were stale. He settled for a packet of crackers and a lukewarm cup of coffee from a thermos someone had shared. His phone battery had long since died, leaving him completely cut off from Caroline. The uncertainty pressed down on him like the weight of the ice outside. He could only hope that she had managed to keep the children safe, that she had found warmth somewhere in the frozen city. Back at the shelter, Caroline noticed the strain etched into the faces of the volunteers. They worked tirelessly, organizing supplies, distributing meals, and comforting those who broke down in tears. She approached one of them, a young woman in her 20s, and offered to help. Soon, Caroline found herself assisting with the distribution of blankets, guiding new arrivals to empty spaces, and playing with children who cried for warmth and comfort. It gave her a sense of purpose, something to focus on besides the gnawing fear for her husband. The Petersons, though weak, insisted on contributing as well. Mr. Peterson shared stories with the children, distracting them from the cold and fear, while Mrs. Peterson helped fold blankets and organize small donations that continued to trickle in from residents outside the storm zone. The shelter had become more than a refuge. It was a fragile community born out of necessity. Days blurred together. Each morning began with the line for food, each afternoon filled with whispered conversations about when the power might return, each night accompanied by the steady hum of the generator. The children adapted more quickly than the adults. Emma and Daniel made friends with other children in the shelter, their laughter echoing faintly through the gymnasium, a small reminder of resilience. Caroline clung to that sound as proof that hope was still alive. At the hospital, the situation worsened before it improved. Supplies of bottled water ran dangerously low. Nurses filled buckets with melted ice to flush toilets. Power outages grew more frequent, and each flicker of the lights brought a moment of panic. Still, Michael pressed on. He was there when a baby was born in the middle of the storm, the cries of new life mingling with the hum of generators. He was there when a man who had been brought in with frostbite finally smiled after learning he would keep most of his fingers. He was there when exhaustion overtook one of his colleagues, and he carried her to a chair so she could rest. Through it all, Michael carried the image of his family in his mind like a lantern in the dark. He imagined Caroline's determined face, Emma's soft laughter, Daniel's stubborn bravery. He did not know where they were, but he believed in Caroline's strength to keep them safe. That belief was enough to keep him moving. By the end of the week, the storm finally began to loosen its grip. Temperatures rose slightly, enough to melt some of the ice on the roads. The skies cleared, revealing a pale winter sun. Slowly, power crews restored electricity to certain parts of the city. The announcement spread quickly through the shelter, and people wept with relief at the thought of lights returning, of heaters working again, of water flowing once more through the pipes. Caroline felt tears in her eyes as she heard the news. Yet she also knew it would take time before their home was livable again. Burst pipes would need repair, spoiled food thrown out, and broken branches cleared. But there was a light now, faint but undeniable. The storm was ending. The hospital, too, felt the shift. Generators were no longer the only source of power, and the lights grew steadier. Relief washed over the staff, though exhaustion clung to them. Michael finally allowed himself to breathe more deeply, though his thoughts immediately turned to his family. He asked around for updates on shelters, and a colleague mentioned that Lamar High School had been one of the main centers for displaced families. Michael clung to that thread of information as if it were a lifeline. 2 days later, when the roads were safe enough for travel, Michael left the hospital after what felt like an eternity. He borrowed a colleague's truck, its tires equipped for the icy remnants still clinging to the streets, and drove carefully toward the shelter. The city around him looked wounded. Trees lay broken, roofs sagged, and whole neighborhoods were marked by the absence of light in windows that once glowed warmly. Yet there were also signs of recovery. Neighbors working together to clear debris, volunteers handing out supplies, and the faint hum of restored power lines. When Michael arrived at Lamar High School, his heart pounded as he stepped inside. The gymnasium was still filled with families, though fewer than before. He scanned the room desperately, his eyes searching every face. Then, near the far wall, he saw them. Caroline looked up first, her eyes widening with disbelief. Emma and Daniel followed her gaze, and within moments they were running across the gymnasium floor, their voices crying out in joy. Michael dropped to his knees as they collided with him, wrapping his arms around them with a sob of relief. Caroline reached him next, and for a long moment they held each other, the world around them fading into silence. The Petersons smiled from their cots, their tired faces lighting up at the sight of the reunion. Around them, other families looked on with quiet smiles, sharing in the joy. Michael whispered into Caroline's ear, his voice breaking. "I was so afraid. I didn't know if you were safe." Caroline held him tighter. "We made it. We're here. We never stopped waiting for you." For the first time in weeks, Michael felt warmth that had nothing to do with fire or blankets. It was the warmth of family, of survival, of knowing that they had endured the storm together, even while apart. The city of Houston would need time to heal. Homes would need repair, lives would need rebuilding, and memories of the storm would linger like scars. But for the Johnson family, the most important thing had already been restored. They were together again, and that was enough to carry them forward into whatever came next. By the time dawn broke, the city of Houston was no longer recognizable. The familiar hum of traffic was replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of frozen branches collapsing under their own weight. Frost glazed over car windows like thin sheets of glass, and icicles dangled from rooftops that had never seen such extremes. The Johnson family woke to a house colder than they had ever felt before. Their breath lingered in the air as a thin mist, and even the walls seemed to radiate the chill that had seeped deep inside overnight. Michael rose first, moving carefully through the darkened house with a flashlight that was already losing its strength. The heater remained silent, the refrigerator was nothing more than a cold box, and the kitchen faucet released only a reluctant drip before freezing entirely. Outside, snow continued to fall, fine and relentless, layering over the frozen city like a soft but merciless blanket. He checked on Caroline and the children. Emma was still asleep under a pile of blankets, her small frame curled tightly, while Daniel was awake, shivering but trying to hide it with a brave smile. Caroline's eyes met Michael's, and in that unspoken moment, they both knew the day ahead would be harder than the night before. They needed water, food, and warmth, things that had always been a given but now felt like distant luxuries. The first challenge came when Michael tried to open the front door. It was frozen shut, the ice having sealed it overnight. After several minutes of careful prying with a kitchen knife and a metal spatula, it finally gave way, groaning as if protesting the intrusion. The world outside was unrecognizable. The street was buried under snow and coated with a glassy layer of ice that made walking treacherous. Cars sat abandoned, their batteries dead and doors frozen. A neighbor 2 houses down, Mrs. Thompson, stood on her porch wrapped in multiple layers of scarves, waving at Michael. "Any power?" she called, her voice hoarse from the cold air. "Nothing yet," Michael replied, his breath puffing into clouds. "We lost water too." "So did we. My son's trying to melt snow in a pot for the toilet." It was a strange new reality. melting snow for water, rationing canned food, and layering clothes just to sit indoors. Michael knew they couldn't wait for help that might not come soon. He decided to make the half-mile walk to the nearest grocery store, hoping it might still be open. Caroline hesitated to let him go, but they both understood it was necessary. The journey through the frozen streets was slow and perilous. Michael slipped twice on black ice, steadying himself with gloved hands that were already losing feeling. Along the way, he passed scenes that would stay with him forever. A man trying to jumpstart a neighbor's car for heat, a family huddled in the bed of a pickup truck near a running engine, and an elderly woman wrapped in blankets sitting on her porch, refusing to leave her house despite the cold. When Michael finally reached the small grocery store, the scene inside was chaotic. Shelves were stripped bare, and people were quietly but desperately grabbing whatever remained. Cans of soup, bottled water, even baby formula. The power had gone out there too, and employees were using flashlights to ring up purchases on battery-powered calculators. Michael managed to gather a few essentials: 2 gallons of water, some canned beans, a loaf of bread, and a bag of rice. It wasn't much, but it was something. Back home, Caroline welcomed him with relief and tears. The children devoured the bread and soup as if it were a feast, and for a brief moment, their spirits lifted. Yet outside, the storm continued its assault. The temperature dropped even lower that night, and news spread through battery-powered radios that the state's power grid had failed catastrophically. Millions were without electricity, and the situation might not improve for days. The second night was even colder than the first. They huddled together in the living room, wrapping themselves in every blanket they owned. Michael lit a few candles, their small flames flickering like fragile hope. The sound of the wind outside grew louder, almost violent, as if testing the strength of every wall and window. Sleep came in short, restless bursts, interrupted by the groans of the house contracting in the cold and the occasional crash of a tree limb outside. On the third day, water lines across the neighborhood began to burst. The Johnsons were lucky. Their pipes had frozen but hadn't ruptured. Yet several houses nearby were flooding with icy water. Volunteers from the local church came door to door, checking on elderly residents and distributing bottled water from emergency supplies. Michael offered to help, joining them in their rounds. They found one man, Mr. Alvarez, unconscious in his recliner from hypothermia. Paramedics arrived just in time, bundling him in thermal blankets and rushing him to the nearest hospital still running on generator power. Meanwhile, Caroline focused on keeping the children occupied. She invented games, told stories, and taught them how to melt snow in pots for washing dishes. In a strange way, the crisis brought them closer together. They ate meals by candlelight, shared stories late into the night, and learned to find joy in the smallest comforts. A warm cup of tea, a moment of sunlight breaking through the clouds, or a battery-powered radio playing a song from before the storm. But the situation beyond their little home was worsening. Shelters were overflowing, hospitals were stretched to the limit, and firefighters were responding to dozens of house fires caused by people using grills and gas stoves indoors for heat. Michael received a call from the hospital asking if he could return to work. They needed every available nurse, and though Caroline feared for his safety, she knew he had to go. The drive back to Memorial Hermann was harrowing. Streets were slick with ice, traffic lights were dead, and intersections had turned into dangerous free-for-alls. Inside the hospital, chaos reigned. The emergency room was overflowing with patients, frostbite cases, carbon monoxide poisoning, broken bones from falls on ice. The staff worked tirelessly, many of them sleeping on cots in the break room because it was too dangerous to go home. Michael worked 16 hours straight that day, moving from patient to patient, administering 4 fluids, treating hypothermia, comforting frightened families. In one corner of the ER, a woman sobbed as her elderly father was pronounced dead. Another casualty of a storm that had turned one of America's warmest states into a frozen wasteland. When he finally returned home, exhausted and numb, Michael found the house still dark but alive with warmth. Caroline had managed to make a small stew from the last of their canned food, and the children ran to greet him, their laughter a small light in the darkness. They ate together quietly, grateful for each other, for their safety, and for the resilience that had carried them this far. Yet the storm was not done with them. Forecasts predicted several more days of freezing temperatures, and rolling blackouts continued across the state. The Johnsons, like millions of Texans, would have to endure even longer, relying on each other, on their neighbors, and on the hope that spring would eventually break through the icy grip of winter. As night fell once again, the candles were lit, the blankets pulled close, and the family settled in for another uncertain night. Outside, the wind howled over a city brought to its knees. Inside, though, there was a flicker of something stronger than the storm, the unbreakable human will to survive. And somewhere in the darkness, far beyond the frozen rooftops and silent streets, the promise of warmth and light still waited, just beyond the horizon. The following morning began with a faint glimmer of sunlight pressing against the frosted windows. For the first time in days, the snowstorm seemed to have paused, leaving behind a frozen stillness that hung heavy over Houston. The Johnson family stirred awake slowly, their bodies stiff from another night spent huddled together on the living room floor. The air inside the house was so cold that touching any metal surface felt like pressing skin against ice. Michael was the first to rise, carefully slipping away from Caroline and the children. His steps creaked over the wooden floor, and each breath left a puff of white mist in the air. He reached the kitchen and tested the faucet again. Only silence met him. The pipes were frozen solid, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they could burst like many others in the neighborhood. Caroline joined him soon after, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Her face was pale, but she managed a small smile. Together they decided that it was time to conserve what little water they had left. They melted snow on the stovetop, carefully rationing each cup to wash dishes, brush teeth, and prepare what little food remained. It felt strange, almost surreal, to be living this way in the heart of one of America's largest cities. Later that morning, Michael ventured outside to check on the neighborhood. The streets were eerily silent, save for the occasional crack of ice breaking from tree branches. He saw his neighbor, Mr. Davis, standing by his driveway, staring at the water pouring from his garage. A pipe had burst inside, flooding the entire lower floor. Michael offered to help, and together with another neighbor, they worked to move furniture and salvage what they could. Despite the misery, there was also solidarity. Neighbors who rarely spoke before were now sharing supplies, offering blankets, and checking on one another. A sense of community had grown out of necessity. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman from down the street, invited several children into her living room to keep them distracted with stories from her childhood. Michael noticed that even in the midst of hardship, people were finding small ways to bring comfort to one another. By afternoon, Michael returned home and switched on the battery-powered radio to hear the latest updates. The news was grim. More than 4 million Texans were still without power. Dozens of deaths had been reported, most from hypothermia or carbon monoxide poisoning. The state's power grid had nearly collapsed, and though rolling blackouts were being attempted, they were inconsistent and unreliable. Grocery stores and gas stations were running out of supplies. Hospitals were overwhelmed. The Johnson children listened quietly, their eyes wide. Daniel asked if the lights would ever come back. Michael crouched beside him, pulling him into a hug. "They will," he said softly, though his voice carried uncertainty. Emma clutched her stuffed rabbit and buried her face in Caroline's lap. For them, the world had turned upside down in just a matter of days. That evening, Michael prepared to return to the hospital. He knew it would be another long shift, but the call of duty pressed heavily on him. Caroline helped him gather his things, tucking extra socks and a thermos of hot tea into his bag. "Be careful," she whispered, her hand lingering on his arm. "The roads are still dangerous." The drive was treacherous. Ice clung to the roads like glass, and abandoned cars lined the shoulders where drivers had lost control. Traffic lights were still out, forcing intersections into chaotic guessing games. By the time Michael arrived at Memorial Hermann, He felt as though he had navigated through a battlefield. Inside the hospital, the scene was worse than before. Hallways overflowed with patients, cots lined every available space, and the staff moved with a frantic energy that bordered on exhaustion. Many of Michael's colleagues hadn't left the hospital in days, sleeping in shifts wherever they could find space. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the metallic tang of oxygen tanks and the constant beeping of monitors created an overwhelming symphony of urgency. Michael was assigned to the emergency room once again. He treated patients with frostbite, administered oxygen to those poisoned by carbon monoxide, and comforted frightened families who had nowhere else to turn. One patient, a young mother, had carried her infant through the snow for nearly 2 miles after her home lost heat entirely. Both were suffering from hypothermia, but with immediate care, they survived. The gratitude in her eyes stayed with Michael long after his shift ended. Meanwhile, Caroline faced her own challenges at home. The temperature inside the house had dropped so low that she could see frost forming on the inside of the windows. She gathered Emma and Daniel close, playing small games by candlelight to keep their minds occupied. She read from old storybooks, her voice steady even as her hands trembled from the cold. At one point, she heard a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Thompson, asking if she could warm herself by the Johnsons' fireplace for a while. Caroline welcomed her in, grateful for the company. Together, they shared what little food they had, creating a sense of family in the midst of disaster. By the 4th day, the situation in the city had become dire. Grocery stores were empty, water treatment plants had failed, and shelters were beyond capacity. News reports spoke of families burning furniture to stay warm, of parents lining up outside distribution centers for bottled water, and of elderly residents trapped in homes without heat or supplies. Michael returned home after another grueling shift, his face lined with exhaustion. He collapsed onto the couch, too tired to eat. Caroline sat beside him, rubbing his shoulders gently. "The kids are holding on," she said softly, "but they ask for you every night." He nodded, his eyes closing. "I'll be here tomorrow. I just need a little rest." That night, the power flickered on for the first time in days. The lights glowed weakly, the heater rumbled to life, and the family erupted with joy. Emma and Daniel danced in circles, laughing and clapping their hands. Caroline let out a sigh of relief, tears streaming down her face. But just as quickly as it had come, the power shut off again, plunging the house back into darkness. The children groaned in disappointment, but Michael managed a tired smile. "See, it's coming back. Maybe tomorrow it will stay." The days that followed blurred together in a mixture of struggle and perseverance. Power returned sporadically, sometimes for an hour, sometimes less. Each time it did, the Johnsons rushed to charge their phones, heat water, and cook meals before it disappeared again. It became a race against time, a constant adaptation to uncertainty. Finally, after nearly a week, the storm began to ease. The sun returned, melting the snow into slush that clogged the streets and created new challenges. Broken pipes left homes flooded, debris littered the sidewalks, and the city bore scars that would take months to repair. Yet there was also relief. Trucks began delivering supplies again, water stations opened, and shelters slowly emptied as families returned to their homes. For the Johnson family, the ordeal had left a mark they would never forget. They had faced the coldest nights of their lives, relied on each other in the darkest hours, and discovered strength in their own resilience. Michael continued his work at the hospital. Caroline found new gratitude in simple comforts like running water and warm meals. And the children learned the value of family and community in ways no classroom could ever teach. As the city of Houston slowly thawed, life began to move forward again. But for those who lived through it, the memory of that week, the week when the lights went out, when silence replaced the hum of daily life, and when survival meant clinging to hope, would remain forever. And even as warmth returned and the streets grew busy once more, the Johnsons knew that the storm had changed them. It had shown them the fragility of modern life, but also the enduring strength of the human spirit. The night the lights went out in Texas would never be forgotten. When the storm finally passed and the last of the snow began to melt into icy rivers that ran down the streets, Houston seemed like a city waking from a nightmare. The silence that had once blanketed the neighborhoods gave way to the sound of dripping water, chainsaws cutting through fallen trees, and the low rumble of trucks bringing supplies back into the city. The Johnson family, like so many others, stepped out of their home to see the damage with their own eyes. The yard was littered with broken branches. The wooden fence along the side had collapsed under the weight of the ice. Across the street, a neighbor's roof had partially caved in, and several homes bore the scars of burst pipes and flooding. The children stared wide-eyed at the destruction. For Emma and Daniel, the world seemed transformed, like stepping into a different city altogether. Caroline stood on the porch, holding her coat tight against the lingering chill, and whispered, "It looks like a war zone." Michael nodded quietly, his mind already racing with what needed to be done. The crisis inside their home had passed, but the rebuilding outside had only just begun. Within days, officials began coordinating relief efforts. Trucks lined up at community centers, handing out bottled water and ready-to-eat meals. Volunteers went door to door, checking on families who had been cut off during the storm. Michael, though still exhausted from long shifts at the hospital, joined these efforts on his days off. He couldn't ignore the call to help, not after seeing firsthand how close some had come to losing everything. One afternoon, he and a group of neighbors worked together to clear ice and debris from the streets. They shoveled snow, chopped fallen branches, and patched roofs with tarps provided by the local church. The work was grueling, but there was laughter mixed with the sweat. People who had once passed each other without more than a polite nod were now bound by shared hardship. Inside the Johnson home, life began to regain a fragile rhythm. Power returned steadily now, and the hum of the refrigerator felt like a miracle. Caroline set about cleaning the house, drying damp blankets, and scrubbing away the faint traces of mold where condensation had seeped in. She took extra care to make the house feel warm and welcoming again, believing that her children needed not just safety, but a sense of normalcy. At night, around the dinner table, the family shared stories of their days. Daniel told of helping Mrs. Thompson carry groceries when she finally returned from a shelter. Emma shared how she and a few other children had painted pictures for families whose homes had been badly damaged. Michael listened, pride swelling in his chest, though fatigue still weighed heavily on his shoulders. But beneath the surface, the emotional toll lingered. Caroline often found herself waking in the middle of the night, startled by the absence of sound. For days, she had listened to the storm's howling winds, and now the silence felt too sharp, too fragile. She would walk through the house, checking the heater, the lights, the faucets, as though afraid they might vanish again at any moment. The children, too, carried invisible scars. Emma began to keep her stuffed rabbit close at all times, even during the day. Daniel asked daily if the lights would go out again. Their questions came in soft voices, filled with the kind of worry that children should never have to carry. Caroline comforted them with patience, repeating that the storm had passed, that spring was coming, and that they were safe now. For Michael, the weight of the storm was felt most at the hospital. Even after the weather improved, patients continued to arrive, suffering from the delayed effects of exposure, dehydration, and illness. He saw families broken by loss, children who had lost grandparents, and elderly couples who had endured days alone in freezing homes. Each story cut deeply, and Michael carried them home like silent burdens. One evening, he sat with Caroline on the porch, watching the sun sink low over the quiet street. "It's strange," he said softly, "how something like this can strip everything away. Electricity, water, comfort, all gone in an instant. But what stays, what keeps us going, is each other." Caroline leaned against him, her breath a small cloud in the cool evening air. "I don't think I'll ever take it for granted again. A warm house, a full fridge, even the sound of the heater running. It all feels like a gift now." As weeks turned into months, the city began to heal. Repairs were made, businesses reopened, and children returned to school with stories of the Great Freeze that would one day become part of local memory. Yet for those who lived through it, the memories were not just stories. They were lived experiences etched deep into their hearts. The Johnsons never forgot the nights spent by candlelight, the meals of canned beans and melted snow, or the fear of not knowing when help would come. But they also remembered the kindness of neighbors, the laughter of their children despite the cold, and the resilience that had carried them through. Emma, in her school essay about the winter storm, wrote that the darkest nights made the smallest lights shine the brightest. Her teacher read it aloud to the class, and several parents wept quietly in the back of the room. Daniel, inspired by the firefighters and paramedics he saw rushing through the storm, announced one evening that he wanted to be a rescuer when he grew up. Caroline began volunteering at the local shelter, helping families still recovering from the damage. She found purpose in comforting others, just as she had comforted her own children during the storm. Michael continued his work at the hospital, but with a renewed sense of gratitude for every life saved, for every moment of warmth, and for the community that had risen from the ice stronger than before. Years later, when the memory of the storm softened but never faded, the Johnson family would sit together and recall those nights when the lights went out in Texas. They would speak of fear, of cold, of hardship, but also of unity, resilience, and hope. The storm had tested them, stripped life down to its bare essentials, and in doing so had revealed what truly mattered. The night the lights went out in Texas was not just a story of survival. It was a story of humanity, of families bound together by love, of neighbors becoming friends, and of a city discovering its strength in the harshest of winters. And though the warmth of spring eventually erased the ice, the lessons of that frozen week remained. Reminders that even when the world falls silent, even when the dark and the cold press hardest against our lives, there is always a light waiting to be kindled within us. When spring finally arrived in Houston, it felt as though the city had awakened from a long, difficult slumber. The trees that had been stripped bare by ice slowly sprouted new leaves, and the sound of birds returned to the neighborhoods where silence and sirens had once ruled. For the Johnson family, the warmth of the sun felt like a blessing every time it touched their faces. But even as life returned to a semblance of normalcy, the memories of the storm clung to them like shadows. Michael returned to his regular shifts at the hospital, but he was not the same man who had walked into those halls before the storm. He carried with him the images of patients shivering under thin blankets, of families huddled together in waiting rooms, of colleagues who had worked until their bodies nearly gave out. He had seen strength in people, but he had also seen fragility. In quiet moments, he would replay those nights in his mind, and sometimes the weight of it left him sleepless. Caroline noticed the change. She would watch him as he sat at the dinner table, his gaze distant, his food untouched. She knew he was reliving those days in his mind. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, she placed a hand over his. "You did everything you could," she said softly. "More than most. Don't carry the whole storm on your shoulders." Michael squeezed her hand gently, but he didn't respond. He knew she was right, but the guilt of not being able to save everyone still lingered. For the children, the storm had left its own mark. Emma began to draw pictures of houses with glowing windows, fireplaces with tall flames, and families sitting together in warm light. She gave these drawings to her teachers, to neighbors, and sometimes slipped them into Michael's work bag, as though trying to remind everyone that warmth and light could always return. Daniel, on the other hand, became fascinated by stories of rescue workers. He watched documentaries about firefighters, studied books about paramedics, and asked endless questions about how to keep people safe during emergencies. One night, he told his parents that when he grew up, he wanted to make sure no family ever had to suffer in the cold the way they had. Caroline also found herself changed. Before the storm, she had been a woman who kept to herself, focused mostly on her home and her children. But in the weeks that followed, she had discovered a strength she never knew she had. She began volunteering at shelters, working with families who had lost their homes and coordinating food drives at the local church. She found purpose in helping others, and in that purpose she found healing. The neighborhood itself had grown closer. Where once people passed by each other with polite nods, now they stopped to talk, to ask about each other's families, to share small victories and hardships. The memory of sharing supplies, of checking on one another during the darkest nights, had built bonds that would not easily be broken. Community gatherings became more frequent, not just for holidays, but simply to celebrate the return of ordinary life. A working heater, a stocked grocery store, a clear road. Yet not everything healed so quickly. Many homes remained damaged for months. Some families never returned, forced to move away after the storm destroyed what they had built. Local businesses struggled, and some closed their doors forever. The scars of that week were visible in broken buildings and empty storefronts, reminders of how fragile the comforts of modern life could be. One evening in late summer, the Johnson family sat on their porch as the sun set. The air was warm, and the smell of barbecues drifted through the neighborhood. Emma and Daniel played on the lawn while Caroline and Michael sipped iced tea. Caroline broke the silence first. "Do you think we'll ever forget it?" Michael shook his head slowly. "I don't think so. And maybe we shouldn't. It taught us things we didn't want to learn, but things we needed to know. How to endure. How to rely on each other. How to be grateful." Caroline nodded, her eyes on the children. "I just don't want them to carry fear forever. They're so young." "They won't," Michael said, his voice steady. "They'll remember, but it'll become part of their story. And stories can give strength." As the years passed, that prediction proved true. The children grew, the neighborhood rebuilt, and Houston slowly recovered. But the memory of the storm never disappeared. On cold nights, when the wind rattled the windows, Caroline still lit a candle, not because she needed the light, but because it brought her comfort. Michael continued his work at the hospital with a deeper sense of duty, always mindful of how fragile life could be. Emma grew into a young woman who used her art to tell stories of resilience, while Daniel pursued studies that would one day prepare him for the work of saving lives. The Johnson family carried the storm with them, not as a burden, but as a reminder. They had lived through the night when the lights went out in Texas, and in doing so, they had learned what truly mattered. It was not the hum of electricity, the glow of screens, or the abundance of stores. It was the warmth of family, the kindness of neighbors, and the will to endure together. Even many years later, when people spoke of the storm of 2021, the Johnsons would share their story. They spoke of the cold, the fear, the silence, but they also spoke of the laughter of children huddled under blankets, of neighbors helping neighbors, of strangers saving lives in overwhelmed hospitals. Their story was not just about survival. It was about resilience, hope, and the strength found in unity. And so, the night the lights went out in Texas became more than just a chapter in their lives. It became a testament to the enduring spirit of a family, a community, and a city that learned to rise again after being brought to its knees by nature's fury. Every time winter rolled around after that, every time the air grew sharp and cold, the Johnson family would gather together and remember. They would light a candle, not out of necessity, but out of reverence for the storm that had tested them and the love that had carried them through. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained, etched not only in the city's history, but in the hearts of those who had lived it. Years drifted by like pages turning in a book, and the memory of that cold February in 2021 never fully left the Johnson family. What had once been an overwhelming ordeal transformed into a story told at gatherings, a lesson whispered before bedtime, and a reminder etched into their lives with a permanence that no passing season could erase. Emma grew into a teenager with a soul older than her years. The sketches she once made of glowing houses and flickering fireplaces became more intricate, evolving into full canvases filled with color and light. Her teachers marveled at the way she could capture emotion, not just scenery. She often said she painted to bring back the warmth she had missed during the storm, though she rarely explained it further. Her art began to appear in small exhibitions, and neighbors would proudly remark how Emma's pieces carried hope in every stroke. When asked where her inspiration came from, she always returned to the memory of that week when her family sat huddled together, sharing the last bits of heat they could muster. Daniel, now a few years older, carried the storm in a different way. He had grown taller, his voice deeper, but his fascination with rescue workers never faded. He read books about survival, first aid, and even basic engineering. He often tinkered with old gadgets, trying to invent devices that could help families survive blackouts. One summer, with the help of a local mentor, he built a small portable heater powered by solar panels. It was crude, but when he showed it to his parents, Michael's eyes misted with pride. "You're building what we needed," he told him, his voice low with emotion. Daniel smiled, already thinking of ways to make it better. Michael himself had not forgotten the storm, but instead of letting the memories weigh him down, he began channeling them into his work. He pushed for changes at the hospital, advocating for better backup systems and emergency preparedness. Whenever new staff joined, he would gather them and recount his experiences during the blackout, not to frighten them, but to remind them of their duty when everything else failed. The nights of tending to shivering patients under failing lights had reshaped his understanding of medicine, teaching him that healing went beyond treatments and surgeries. It was also about presence, reassurance, and compassion when hope seemed dim. Caroline had grown into a pillar of her community. The quiet homemaker she once was had given way to a leader who could organize food drives, manage shelter volunteers, and advocate for her neighborhood. People respected her calmness, her ability to find solutions when others only saw problems. She often said that the storm had cracked something open inside her, a realization that she could not just keep her family safe, but extend that care to others. She had lived through the cold and fear, and now she felt compelled to ensure that fewer families faced such trials alone. The neighborhood itself never fully returned to the way it had been before the storm. It was closer now, more tightly knit. Block parties became frequent, not grand or extravagant, but filled with laughter, shared meals, and a quiet appreciation for community. When winter approached, people checked in on one another, made sure homes were stocked with blankets, candles, and bottled water. The storm had taught them that isolation was dangerous, but unity could save lives. 5 years later, in 2026, another winter rolled across Texas. It was nothing like the great storm of 2021, but the temperature dipped low enough to trigger anxiety in those who remembered. Caroline found herself lighting a candle once again, not out of need, but as a ritual. Emma, now in college, called home to reassure her parents she was prepared. She had packed blankets, extra batteries, and food, just as her mother had taught her. Daniel, in his final year of high school, volunteered at a local emergency response program, distributing supplies to elderly residents. This time, the community was ready, and though the cold cut deep, it did not break them. In 2031, 10 years after the storm, Emma's art was showcased in a gallery in Dallas. One of her most striking pieces was titled, "The Night the Lights Went Out." It depicted a family huddled in darkness, illuminated by a single candle. Around them, shadows loomed, but in their faces shone resilience. Visitors to the gallery stood in silence before the painting, some moved to tears. Emma dedicated the piece to her parents, whose strength and love had carried her through those nights of fear. Daniel, now studying engineering at university, continued to pursue his dream of designing technology for disaster preparedness. He developed improved solar-powered heating devices and water purification systems, inspired by the scarcity his family once endured. His professors praised his passion, often noting that his ideas weren't born from theory, but from lived experience. "I just don't want anyone else to feel helpless," he explained simply when asked about his motivation. Michael and Caroline, growing older but no less resilient, watched their children with quiet pride. Sometimes, when they sat on the porch in the evening, they would reflect on how the storm had changed everything. Michael would remember the silence of the hospital halls, Caroline the flickering candles in the living room, Emma the sketchbooks she filled with warmth, and Daniel the freezing nights that had sparked his determination. They carried those memories like a thread woven through their lives, binding them closer even as the years stretched on. The neighborhood too had grown. Families who had once been strangers became lifelong friends. Children who had played together in the cold grew into adults who now shared barbecues, weddings, and milestones. The storm had written a chapter into their lives that could not be erased, and though it had been born of hardship, it left behind a legacy of unity and strength. When the Johnson family gathered each year in February, they always told the story again. They told it not to dwell on suffering, but to honor what they had survived. The children listened, even as they grew older, and the story became part of the family's history, a legend that shaped their identity. "We lived through the night the lights went out in Texas," they would say, and in those words was not fear but pride. Even as decades passed, even as technology advanced and new systems promised greater security against future disasters, the Johnsons never forgot. They continued to light a single candle every winter, placing it in the center of the table, its glow reflecting in their eyes. It was a symbol not of darkness, but of light that endured. The storm had come and gone, but its lessons remained: resilience, unity, and the power of family. The Johnsons had survived not just because of what they had, but because of who they were together. And that truth carried them through every season that followed, a quiet testament to the night when the lights went out and love became the brightest flame in the dark. By the time 2 full decades had passed since the great storm of 2021, the Johnson family's lives had grown and branched in directions that no one could have imagined during those freezing nights. The memory of that week still lived within each of them, yet now it was woven into the fabric of their identities rather than lingering as a wound. What had once been nights of silence and fear had transformed into the foundation of their strength, shaping choices, careers, and even the way they related to the world around them. Emma was 30 now, a painter whose work was admired not only across Texas but throughout the country. Her exhibitions often carried themes of resilience, survival, and the fragile beauty of light and darkness. One of her most famous series was titled Frozen Silence, which depicted communities huddled together in icy landscapes, illuminated by candles or lanterns. Critics praised her for capturing the tension between despair and hope, and audiences were moved because they could feel that the images came from lived truth. Emma herself never denied where the inspiration came from. At gallery openings, when asked about her childhood, she would speak calmly about the storm, about the sound of wind rattling the windows, the breath of her little brother fogging the air, the way her mother's arms had been the only place of warmth. People would listen in quiet, many with tears, realizing that behind every painting was a family's story of survival. Daniel, at 27, had become an engineer deeply involved in disaster response design. He had turned his fascination with survival into a profession, working with organizations to develop low-cost, sustainable technologies for communities vulnerable to blackouts, storms, and shortages. His solar-powered heating devices were no longer crude prototypes, but fully functional systems being tested in rural areas and shelters. His work took him around the world, yet he always carried his roots with him. In conferences, he would stand before crowds of scientists and policymakers and tell them, "I know what it feels like to be powerless in the cold, to watch your family shiver, to hear silence where comfort should be. That is why I build. That is why I design." His conviction inspired many, and though he was still young, he was already recognized as someone whose innovations were changing lives. Michael had retired from full-time hospital work, but remained a mentor to younger doctors. The nights of that storm still shaped his lectures. He spoke often about the importance of compassion, of presence in moments when technology failed. "Machines may stop, electricity may fade, but humanity must never go dark," he would tell his students. He carried himself with calm dignity, yet those closest to him knew that the images of 2021 never truly left his mind. In quiet hours, he would sit by the window, watching winter winds stir the trees, and his thoughts would drift back to the silent hospital corridors, the faces of patients wrapped in coats, the smell of antiseptic mixed with candle smoke. But instead of grief, he now held gratitude for having endured, for the lessons that still shaped the lives of his children. Caroline, too, had grown into someone larger than the role she once knew. She was recognized in her community as a leader, often organizing local resilience workshops, teaching families how to prepare for emergencies, how to find strength in unity. People turned to her not only for practical guidance, but also for comfort. She had become, in many ways, the heart of her neighborhood. Every winter, she still lit a candle in her home, placing it at the center of the table. It had become a ritual not only for her family, but for the entire block, as many neighbors followed her example. What once began as a simple act of comfort during the cold had become a symbol of unity that stretched beyond her own home. The neighborhood itself had changed over 2 decades. Children who once bundled together in blankets were now adults raising families of their own. Every February, without fail, the community held a remembrance evening. They called it the Night of the Candle. Houses along the street would dim their electric lights and place candles in their windows, a silent acknowledgement of the storm that had once brought them to their knees. Stories were shared, old memories revisited, and laughter mingled with solemn reflection. It was no longer about fear, but about honoring resilience. The Johnson family always hosted part of the gathering, with Caroline offering warm food, Michael speaking to the group, Emma showing her art, and Daniel demonstrating small devices he had built. Together, they turned remembrance into inspiration. Yet, despite the passing years, winter still carried echoes of unease. On particularly cold nights, when the air was sharp and dry, people would find themselves listening for the silence of a blackout, watching their heaters as though expecting them to fail. The storm had left scars, not on buildings. Those had long been repaired, but in the collective psyche of a generation. It reminded them all that life's conveniences were fragile, that comfort could be stripped away in an instant. But alongside that unease was also a quiet strength, a readiness that had not existed before. By 2041, the 30th anniversary of the storm, the Johnsons gathered once more, this time with grandchildren joining them. Emma's daughter, a curious 6-year-old, asked why the family always lit a candle in the middle of winter. Caroline smiled gently and told her the story, simplifying the details for young ears, but ensuring the lesson remained. There was a time when the lights went out, when the world grew so cold we thought we would not make it. But we had each other, and that made all the difference. This candle is to remind us that even when everything else fails, love and togetherness can keep us warm. The child listened with wide eyes, clutching the candle as though it were something magical. Daniel, sitting beside his son, explained it differently. He spoke of how the storm had sparked his path, how the helplessness of that week had turned into the drive to build solutions. His boy listened, fascinated, and promised that one day he too would invent something that would help people. Michael and Caroline exchanged glances, their hearts swelling as they realized the storm's legacy was not one of fear, but of resilience passed down across generations. The city of Houston itself marked the anniversary with a memorial service. Leaders, families, and survivors came together to reflect. Stories poured forth, of frozen pipes, of neighbors sharing firewood, of strangers saving lives. Among the speakers was Daniel, invited to represent a generation that had turned hardship into innovation. His words echoed across the hall. We are more than the storm. We are the light that endured through it. And as long as we remember, we will never be powerless again. Emma's artwork was displayed at the same event. Her painting Enduring Flame, a massive canvas depicting a single candle illuminating a crowd of shadowed faces, drew hundreds of visitors. Some stood silently before it, whispering memories of their own struggles during those nights. Others wept openly, finding in the image the reflection of their own resilience. As the family walked home that evening, candles flickering in the windows all around, Caroline felt a sense of peace. They had lived through something that could have broken them, yet it had instead built them into who they were. She looked at her children, at her grandchildren, and at the neighbors who still called each other family after all these years. She thought back to that night when the wind howled, when the lights went out, when she feared they would not last until morning. And she realized that though the storm had ended decades ago, its flame still burned, not in destruction, but in love. Each winter, the Johnsons continued their ritual. Each year the candle was lit, its small light carrying more weight than the brightest bulb. For them, the storm was never just about survival. It was about the lesson that family, community, and unity were the greatest sources of warmth. And so long as the candle burned, that truth would never fade. 40 years had passed since the terrible storm of 2021, and the world outside had changed beyond recognition. Technology was everywhere, energy grids were stronger, and homes were far more resilient to the extremes of nature. Yet within the Johnson family, the memory of that week of darkness and cold still held an unshakable place. It had become more than just a chapter in history. It had become a family story, one that bound generations together across time. Emma, now in her 70s, walked slowly through her art studio, her eyes passing over canvases that spanned decades of her life. The early works were raw with emotion, painted when the memory of the storm was still fresh, and her hands trembled with the desire to capture what words could not. Later pieces grew softer, more reflective, blending shadows with gentle light. Her final series, which she worked on with arthritic fingers and a slower brush, was called Generations of Flame. Each canvas showed families in different eras, sitting together by the glow of a single candle. To anyone else, they were beautiful paintings, but to Emma and her family, they were a living testimony. Daniel, now 67, carried the storm within him in a different way. His inventions had become widely adopted, and communities all over the world relied on the devices he had once dreamed of as a boy in a freezing Texas home. Portable heaters, compact water filtration units, and resilient solar panels bore his name, though he never cared for recognition. For him, the reward was in knowing that somewhere, a child did not have to shiver in the cold the way he once had. His voice had grown slower with age, but his mind was still sharp, and his children often said that whenever winter came, his eyes grew brighter, filled with a kind of determination that had never faded. Michael and Caroline were gone now, having passed peacefully in their later years, but their legacy lingered. Their names were spoken at every February gathering, their pictures framed on the mantle, their stories retold by children and grandchildren who never knew the cold of 2021 but felt its echo in every candlelit remembrance. On quiet nights, Emma still whispered prayers of gratitude for them, for the way they had carried the family through, for the strength they had passed on. The Johnson grandchildren had grown into adults, raising families of their own. They had heard the storm story so many times that it had become part of their identity. They did not remember the cold themselves, but they felt as though they had lived it, through the voices of their parents, through the candlelit rituals, through the smell of wax and the glow of a single flame in the middle of winter. Some of them pursued paths influenced directly by the story. One granddaughter became a climate researcher, determined to build systems that would prevent future generations from facing such suffering. Another grandson worked as a community organizer, focusing on resilience planning. Each of them carried the storm differently, yet each carried it. The neighborhood, too, had evolved over 40 years. Many of the original families were gone, replaced by new residents, but the tradition of the Night of the Candle remained. Every February, without fail, houses dimmed their lights and placed candles in the windows. Younger families who had never lived through the storm asked their neighbors why, and the answer was always the same: to honor the night when the lights went out, to remember what it meant to endure together. It had become more than just a neighborhood ritual. It was a piece of living history, a reminder passed through generations of Texans that no matter how advanced the world became, no one was immune to the power of nature, and no one could survive without others. In 2061, on the 40th anniversary of the storm, Houston held a citywide remembrance. Streets were filled with quiet candlelight, not just in one neighborhood but across districts, suburbs, and parks. Thousands gathered to share stories, some who had lived through the storm as children now standing with grandchildren of their own. Among the speakers invited to the central ceremony was Emma. Her voice trembled with age, but her words carried weight. She spoke of sitting in the dark as a child, of her father's steady hands, of her mother's unwavering comfort, of her brother's determination to build a better world. That week, she told the crowd, taught us that we are stronger than we think, braver than we know, and more connected than we ever realize. The storm took our light, but it gave us a fire that still burns inside us today. Daniel also stood before the crowd that evening. He spoke less as an inventor and more as a survivor. I was a boy when the storm came. I was frightened, powerless, and cold. But that fear turned into a promise that no one else should feel what I felt. That promise has guided me all my life. And now I pass it on to you. Prepare, protect, and most of all, stand together. That is how we survive, not just storms, but everything that life will throw at us. His words resonated deeply, echoing across the city, carried home in the hearts of those who listened. As the candles flickered across Houston that night, Emma and Daniel sat together, their hands clasped, their families gathered around them. The younger generations looked to them with reverence, knowing they were the living roots of a story that would never die. The storm had tested them, but from that test had come resilience, art, invention, unity, and love. When the ceremony ended and the family returned home, the great-grandchildren crowded around Emma and Daniel, begging for the story once more. And so they told it again, the howling wind, the darkened streets, the frozen pipes, the silence, and the warmth of a family clinging together against the cold. The children listened with wide eyes, just as their parents had before them. And when the story ended, a single candle burned on the table, its flame small but steady, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, light always remained. Over the years, as Emma and Daniel grew friendlier, the responsibility of carrying the story shifted to their children and grandchildren. The ritual of lighting the candle continued, not just in their home, but in countless homes across the city. The story became legend, passed down like a treasure. Teachers told it in schools, artists painted it, engineers designed in its memory, communities built rituals around it. It was no longer just the Johnson family's story. It had become Houston's story. And even 50 years later, when the last survivors of that storm were few, the candles still burned every February, lining windows and porches, shining in churches and community centers. For by then, the storm was more than just history. It was a parable, a symbol of resilience, a testament that even when the world goes dark, humanity has the power to create its own light. The night the lights went out in Texas had never been forgotten. It lived on in every flicker of flame, in every hand held tight against the cold, in every voice that reminded the next generation of what had been endured. And so long as the candles burned, the storm would never truly end. It would remain, not as fear, but as the fire that kept families, communities, and hearts alive. 50 years after the storm, the Johnson family gathered once more, though the faces around the table had changed. Emma and Daniel were gone, their names spoken now with reverence, their portraits hanging on the wall beside those of Michael and Caroline. The house was filled with laughter and the sounds of children, but when the evening came, the room grew quiet as the youngest generation prepared the candle. The flame flickered to life, small yet steady, and silence filled the room. It was a silence not of fear, but of memory. The great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren had never known the storm themselves, yet they spoke of it as if they had lived through it. They told of a family huddled in the dark, of neighbors who shared what little they had, of a city that learned to endure. Outside, the neighborhood too was aglow, windows lined with candles just as they had been every February for decades. What had once been a single family's ritual had become a tradition for an entire city, and perhaps, in time, for the world beyond. As the children leaned close to the candle, their voices hushed. One of them whispered, "We are the light they left behind." And in that moment, the storm of 2021 was no longer just a story of suffering. It was a story of resilience, of love, and of the fire that endures across generations. The night the lights went out in Texas would never be forgotten. It had become more than history, more than legend. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, the smallest flame can guide us home.